Hey everyone, what is going on? Welcome to another episode of the Shed Organics Show. And today is a fabulous conversation. I have been very inspired and excited to talk to our guest today, Phil Dudman. He's from Lismore, just over the border in New South Wales, and is a fairly prominent figure here in Australia and in our gardening community. Now, Phil's been involved with the ABC radio as a host, talking all things gardening. He's been regularly contributing to gardening magazines, various events and workshops that he holds at his home in Lismore. Phil has some wonderful videos all over his social media as well. There's some amazing resources that I highly encourage you to check out after this conversation. He's also done some really cool work helping out a lot of the flood affected areas in the Northern Rivers area of New South Wales. It tends to get quite flooded there, unfortunately, in some of our rainy seasons, which we tend to be in around this time of year on recording around the summertime. But Phil's done some amazing work helping out the community and generally sharing his knowledge of gardening and sustainable practices. So I have absolutely no doubt that you are going to get something out of this conversation. And thank you again to Phil for his time. So let's jump straight in to the conversation with Phil Dudman.
The 60s, mid 60s, and so as a child in the late 60s, I've got fond memories of being in the garden in the backyard, and it was all about the outdoor lifestyle. I grew up in Brisbane, and my parents weren't mad gardeners at all, but of that time, people were very proud of their front gardens and keeping things neat and tidy. So they certainly did that. The lawn was always mowed, the edges were done. But I was the youngest child of three. I had two older sisters, and from all reports, I was an annoying child, and I spent a lot of time annoying the hell out of everyone. So often I'd get sent out of the house into the garden to do jobs in the garden. So that was my kind of forced.
Yeah, right.
It was my forced introduction to gardening, which was like raking up leaves, watering plants, doing that kind of stuff. So I had a lot of time looking at plants and observing them as a child. And I realize now, looking back as an adult, that I was intrigued by plants at that age. So thanks to my misbehavior and my punishments from my mother, or my direction from my mother, it was I was introduced to the world of gardening, but I didn't really realize it was a thing until I was in my 20s. I grew up interested in gardening. Being interested in being outside. I was looking after the garden for the family as I grew up in my teenage years. I remember in the early 80s and the late 70s, there was a real push for native plants. And there's a real movement with native plants in gardens in Australia. And I took an interest in that. And I remember asking my mother to take me to the nursery to buy some plants. I'd often accompany her down there anyway. So I took on a couple of gardens in the backyard, and so that was just a thing. It was something to do. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have mobile phones. We found things to do, and you had to, and it was normally a practical, hands-on thing. So so it wasn't really until I was in my mid-20s that I realized I had a thing for gardening. I'd had a mate in a band that I played with in my early 20s who was a horticulturist, and he was the drummer of the band, and I'd never heard of a horticulturist until I'd met him. I didn't know it was a thing.
Yeah.
But I was intrigued by his interest in plants, and he taught me a lot. Turns out the manager of my band was also interested in what our drummer had to say about the plant world, and he too became a horticulturist. So he had a big
Wow.
influence. he
That's
had
awesome.
he had a big influence on both of us. And
Yeah.
our manager is still a horticulturist today, and so am I. So, it's the people you meet. It's a combination of things that happen through your life.
Yeah.
And yeah, when
I
I
like the way
realized,
you put that. I think it's like it is a combination of those people that become influential, and whether or not, as you say, it's like you've been sort of thrown out into the garden because of your behavior. It's that exposure to the garden, or to people that are inspired by it. And I think like another big reason why I'm very happy to talk to you today is just to share that passion off people and to bounce off the energy that they have to do with plants and to do with the amazing world that we can find in our garden.
well, if it wasn't for our drummer who introduced me to horticulture as a thing, I would never have known about it, and I may not have followed this as a career. And I remember that well, and I try to remind other people that I meet that horticulture is a thing, as a not only an interest but as a job.
Yeah.
And most horticulturists know that it's not particularly well paid industry. There are plenty of opportunities in it, and if you're looking for money, you'll find it. But it's an industry, and it's an occupation that most horticulturists love, and it's rare that you find someone who works in that game that is not a happy person. Um, it's a wonderful way to work every day, to be working with plants and within a natural environment, working in gardens. It's a great feeling.
It really is.
We've all come from nature. We're meant to be in nature. We spend a lot of money on our holidays to connect with nature.
Yeah. That's it.
Horticulturists do it every day, and they create beauty in what they do. And as a result, we are very satisfied, and we don't need for much more other than enjoying that wonderful connection.
I love that, Phil. The way you put that as well is that they are tend to be very happy people. And you notice that in areas of blue zones around the world where people are living longer, they're telling us that a lot of the things they are doing is being in the garden and being around nature and in that natural process, the natural evolutions, the cycles, everything, being in tune with that seems to make us more at peace, more tuned in and aware, and generally happy. And I think it's the connection as well. And something that I really admire about what you do, and something that I'm keen to do myself, is bring more community into what we're doing. And I know that you run and participate in a few workshops and working with a whole bunch of different people in various different areas. Now,
Mm.
how do you see the connection between community and gardening, and how important for you and your general happiness is bringing the community into all of this?
Well, it's interesting. One simple thing that most gardeners would know is that when you're creating a beautiful front garden in particular, and you're working out in that garden, um, most people who will walk past will stop and have a look, and they'll say hello, and they'll engage with you, and they'll comment on how beautiful your garden's looking. It's an expression of yourself. You're doing your own thing out there, and that feels good. But you strike up a conversation, and sometimes those people will be gardeners. Other times they won't, but they're still drawn to it. So just by having that interaction with someone wandering past who's taken an interest in your garden is a great way to connect with the community. But you may be inspiring somebody to do the same thing. It's interesting. I when I first bought my house here in Lismore, one of the things I did was to plant up the footpath, the verge, and create something. It's like an extension of my garden,
Yeah.
and I've filled that area out. I've kept in mind that people have got to walk through there. They've got to be able to, back their cars up and do all that. So the way I've planted it and planned it is that, those things aren't going to be an issue.
Yeah.
But it didn't take long before someone moved in down the road and did the same thing. And now further up the street, there are two adjoining houses up there where people have moved in, and they're talking to me about doing the same thing. So it's not going to be long before our whole street is is going to be full of verge gardens. And then the ones that don't have it, that have just got the grass, they're going to stand out. It's not going to be the verge gardens that stand out
Yeah,
anymore. It's going to
yeah,
be the grass that stands out. And it looks so much better. It feels so much better. We're surrounding ourselves with plants. The birds love it. The insects love it. And people passing by love it as well. And certainly on a hot day, the ones who are walking along the footpath are much preferred. They much prefer going through our little shady
yes,
part of the footpath than the one next to it that is just like out in the blaring sun.
yeah, barren.
So it cools your environment, and it looks far better. But I think you asked something about. I'm trying to remember your question. I've gone off on
No,
a rave there, but
no, I absolutely
the
love it
importance
because
of
it's really
connection with
cool.
community. Yeah, that's
Yes.
right. Yeah, yeah. Oh, look, I think it's such a big part of being a gardener. And as I get older as a gardener, I realize how important it is to just keep talking to people about what you do and what you love, and they respond. And there's a fair bit you learn about gardening that you can share as you get older, and even as a new gardener. And I think if you meet someone who's curious, offer to help them. Offer to help them with some advice on what to plant and how to do it. I mean, we've all done a little
Yes.
bit, and we've learnt things on how to make it easier. Share that knowledge and get people started. People have a lot of setbacks in gardening, and it can actually turn them off and they never want to do it again. So
Hmm.
help them get through those moments so that they can break through and have more successes.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. It's kind of we're seeing ourselves in an earlier stage. I mean, like I was shocking in my first few crops, like so naive, I guess. But finding people like yourself who have walked it for a while and have gone through the trials and tribulations and can share little tips and tricks to stop these general pitfalls and help us all have success in the garden, feel that good feeling of being able to pick the good produce off fresh off the vine, off the tree, whatever it is. It's like it's helping the whole generation come up. A rising tide lifts all boats. There's no competition here. We're trying to help everybody with abundance. And my idea of kind of community, or trying to interact with the community, I love what you said about having these just uh off the cuff conversations that you might, or little interactions you might have, where there's these nuggets of gold you can find with someone's life experience. And there's something in there that's just super magical and just really leaves myself feeling very fulfilled after a nice conversation like that. So I love the idea of being able to share and see people get inspired and seeing people go like, wow, that's amazing that you can do that, and then helping them to do the same thing too. So in your sort of workshops and mentoring and things like this, in that sort of area, um, are you doing that sort of role where you're sharing tips and tricks that you've had and sort of demonstrating and helping people set things up, and like is that what's important to you, try and basically get people together in the same environment to get their hands in the dirt and give it all a go together? Is that the idea?
Yeah, I get a range of people coming along to my workshops. So I run grow your food workshops in my garden here in Lismore, and it's a great venue to do that because people can actually see my garden and see how I operate, and I share with them a bunch of systems really that I use to be able to maximize my food production. So in my garden, we produce 75% of our fruit and vegetable needs, and
Wow.
it's just a small suburban garden. I don't need anything bigger. The total size of our property is about 750 square meters.
Wow.
So there's a house on it as well.
Mm.
So it's not a huge garden,
No.
and it's enough for me to look after. And it's fairly intensive, the growing that's going on there. But I get people who've been gardening for years, and also people who've never gardened before, all coming along in the group. So there's something for everyone, because there's something for people who've never gardened before, and there's stuff for people who have gardened for years to see some of the techniques I put in place and the systems I put in place. So I've been growing food for 30 years, and I've tried all sorts of different ideas, and I'm always looking for new things to try. But I think I've set upon a system that allows me, as a guy who's still basically working full time, to maximize my production and minimize the efforts, and
Yes.
maximize the health of the crops and my soil. And yeah, it's working. And a lot of the things too, I think, for people is that I try to uh, 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 take on a couple of the typical myths and problems that people face.
Hmm.
There are a lot of myths in gardening, a lot of things that go around that people tend to uh, tend to see as the gospel truth in the whole gardening world, and it can get in the way of them exploring and just following their own initiative and their own feeling about something. I think you've got to trust
Yeah.
yourself when you're gardening and not wait to be told on how to do something. Just go with what you feel and try things.
Yes, yeah, that's very
Not
true because it's all different. Like everyone's climate, even a microclimate on your street might be different from having your verge garden cooling it down slightly. So you have a mini microclimate compared to down the end of the street. And in Lismore, you might have a whole range of different weather in one day sometimes. So it's it's so specific to the situation. And I love that you've got people coming in and seeing what you're doing. And one thing that I am really trying to help people out with is being able to garden on any scale and specifically smaller scales because that's tending to be most of us these days is smaller scale. We've got a lot of people in apartments. And we want to try and solve the issue of relying so heavily on the supermarkets to have our own food and to bring more people into the joy of growing their own food. So seeing a great example of maximizing the space and your energy requirements of going out there and spending hours out in the garden, it really is important to help share these techniques. So what I'm aiming at is organic living soil with worms and all sorts of microbes and special things in there, and whether that's in a container or in the soil itself, that's what I'm sort of aiming for. Now, with your garden in particular, or even gardening in general over your career, what sort of switches have you made from maybe previous naive Phil or previous Phil to moving into organics and how do you see the importance of organic gardening versus maybe some of the more conventional gardening techniques?
Well, I've always been an organic gardener from the time I started.
Cool.
I've never used chemicals in my garden.
Amazing.
It was never a consideration. As being a horticulture, I worked with in landscapes and as well in garden centres, and I saw and the nursery industry. I saw a lot of chemical use, um, and I didn't like it at all. But organics has always been a thing for me, and my concern about our food system has always been a thing since I started in my 20s. And I just wanted to grow because I wanted the best food I could get, and fresh food from the garden is without a doubt highly nutritious. And when you know how it's been treated, you don't have to worry about terrible poisons and things that
Yes.
are going into you and going into the earth.
Yes.
So that was one way to be certain of that. But I've tried all sorts of ways of gardening. I started off a no dig gardener using the Esther Dean's method of
Yes.
lasagna, the
Yeah.
lasagna
The
method.
lasagna layers.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. So I did that, and you'd end up building up these piles that were like 60 centimeters tall of organic matter, and often you'd have to buy bits and pieces in and that
Mm.
type of thing. And then I discovered the work of the wonderful Peter Cundall, and he was a digger. So I got into digging for years and did that for probably 15 years,
Yeah. Okay.
and realized it was actually not working for me. I had a lot of weeds. I had a bad back.
Hmm.
It took a lot of time. I didn't like it. I'm 6'5", so digging is not a fun thing for a guy that's my height.
No.
Um, and then I discovered, I thought there's got to be an easier way. I discovered the Back to Eden Gardens, and I started going back to no dig technique. So Back to Eden Gardens, they're
Hmm.
using compost that's been made from wood chip, basically.
Yes.
And then I just got into making compost and using compost in a no dig garden. And so it's been a kind of circle. It's been an evolution back to my initial way, but I've understand more about why I don't dig. So I think we've got a better understanding of soil and how precious it is, and how important it is to leave the soil life undisturbed if you want to maximize your soil life.
Yeah.
So I've been back into no dig for probably about 12 years, and the results have been incredible in my own garden. I mean, in Lismore, we get heavy rainfall here,
Hmm.
and floods regularly. And every summer, you can expect you're going to get a couple of months of heavy rain.
Hmm.
And back when I used to dig, that rain would compact the soil and it would become sodden, and plants would die in February, March because of the wet conditions and the compaction in the soil, the lack of air in the soil. But since I've stopped disturbing the soil, soil life has thrived. The structure of the soil has become strong. There's a good foundation there, and it can rain as heavy as it likes. It just drains away
That's
in my
amazing.
raised beds, and the plants continue on growing. So for me, that's been a remarkable evolution and great
Yes.
to see. I can stand there with a hose and pour water on my no dig beds. So people thinking, hey, how do you aerate it? Well, it is
Yeah.
aerated, and it's permanently aerated. I
With
can
the
stand there
root
and pour
system
it on.
and the, yeah,
I can
mycorrhizal.
pour it on, and the water just sucks away
Yeah.
like it's sand, but it's not. It's clay, and I can stand on it without the fear of compacting the soil because it hasn't been dug. And when you dig the soil, you bust up the structure, and it turns into rubbish. So really has been a remarkable evolution, and it's a big part of the way I garden. So it
Okay.
saves you a lot of time, and
Hmm.
you get far fewer weeds by
Yes.
not digging the
Yeah.
soil.
I think it's like it's essentially getting out of the way of nature, isn't it? We're trying to mimic how it would naturally work in natural systems, and no one's coming in and digging up the first 30 centimeters of soil to every time to put a new crop in it. Nature has the soil food web, as Dr. Elaine likes to put it. That's, I'm very lucky coming up in an age where I can watch all of these wonderful people on free YouTube and things like this and get some amazing knowledge about no-till gardens and leaving the soil system intact. Uh, One question that came to mind just out of curiosity with this is I follow Charles Dowding over in the
Mm.
UK with his no dig gardens, and one of the one of the videos that surprised me actually and has challenged some of my beliefs was about crop rotation. And he had been growing potatoes in the exact same bed year on year on year on year on year on year and still
Mm.
getting wonderfully amazing results. Now, I'm aware it's in the ground, so there's a whole bunch of connection going on underneath the ground. So there's often probably nutrients being cycled around by, any of the fungus underneath the ground and all of the worm activity, things like this. But how does that ring with you? What sort of techniques do you use with crop rotation, or have you got spots in your garden that work for certain things, and that's just where they work year after year, and that's all good?
Well, it's interesting you bring up the case with Charles. He's a wonderful gardener and a very inspiring man. And if I think if there is an issue in your soil with a particular pest problem or disease, you might struggle if you keep going back to the same spot. But if there are no issues with diseases, viruses, whatever, um, fine. But if there is an issue, yeah, you got to find another
Yes.
part of the garden. I have a big issue in my garden with soil-borne viruses, which makes it very difficult for growing tomatoes.
Right.
So I've got crops in the ground now that are suffering as a result of different types of wilt.
Yes.
So I've kind of run out of places to grow tomatoes in a way, and I've had to resort to where I can grafting onto rootstock,
Oh,
which
yes.
is resistant. And this is a problem in a small garden. You're limited, and there will if you read up about crop rotation, they talk about a 4 or 6 bed rotation, and on paper it looks fantastic. Brassicas here, peas here, cucurbits here, and on it goes. And then at the end of the season you just move on one. Well, a backyard garden doesn't work like that. You have some things that finish now, others that are still maturing later. And if you want to maximize your production, you just got to keep planting.
Hmm.
So I try to keep it very simple, and I try to let other people know this, is that if you want to do some sort of crop rotation, keep it simple. Just think whatever I'm pulling out, whatever I put in there is going to be something different. So whenever you're planting
Yeah.
something,
Okay.
make sure it's something that's not related to the crop that was there before. It might just
Mm.
be a row. It's rare that we fill a whole bed with one particular type of crop, because we're just growing for ourselves. We're not growing for market.
Yes.
So, it'll be a row this, row that. So that's all I do. But I think for most crops, I don't get too serious about it.
Mhm.
It's only with tomatoes, which I know really do get hammered by
Yeah.
soil-borne problems.
And that's,
Sometimes
yeah.
potatoes too. So Charles has been very lucky.
Yeah,
That's how
exactly.
good his soil is. A credit to him.
Yeah, well, exactly. And that just again, as you said, brings it back to the soil health. Like we're really I've seen many people say we're growing soil, not growing vegetables or anything like this. We're
Yeah.
trying to actually grow really healthy soil, so then you can grow anything. I was watching one of your videos recently. I presume it's relatively recent because we're in corn growing season at the moment, but you've got you got some grid corn, and you were putting some beans in between,
Mm,
as you know, the old Three Sisters method, and
mm,
using the beans to climb up the corn. And I noticed that you do have just, it's a few continuous beds and just various different things interplanted
mm.
in your garden. So uh, without, obviously, I encourage listeners to go and check out all of your videos and have a look at what you've got on offer. But without them going into it, can you just describe a little bit about the companion planting ideas, and how much are you thinking about uh, obviously what works well together as a companion, and then also the direction of the sun, and the amounts of shade and things that, say, corn might cast over a crop and things like this? How much of that thought is going into your garden?
Yeah, because I've only got a small garden, I'm trying to cram things in, and sometimes I overdo it. But I'm always trying to plant as much as I can, and I'm very conscious of always having something in the ground. So you've got these beds out there; they're rich and lovely. Don't leave them sitting without anything in for too long. Normally if I've harvested a row of something, I've got seedlings ready to go that can go straight in and get the next crop running.
Hmm.
And this is a really important part of maximizing your production. So I will always have some seedlings that I've sown on the go. And if they've filled their punnets and there's no space in the beds ready to go, I'll try to think of some way that I can keep them growing.
Yeah.
I might just pop them up into a next size container and
Hmm.
keep them going. And then, say, another 3 weeks down the track, a space will become available. And these plants are already, excuse me,
No,
just
you're right.
added an apple. Um, these these plants are already 6 weeks old,
Yeah.
perhaps. So
Mm.
you've had a jump start in your production. So I don't ever direct sow, because there's always an issue that you might put in
Hmm.
a row of seed, they fail, takes you 2 weeks to realize what's going on, and you're another 2 weeks behind. So
That's a really good point, actually.
yeah,
Very, very good, because that is maximizing the time and using the sun's energy wisely, like the as you say, the seedlings don't need to go into the ground yet. They can survive happily in cups or little pots for a few weeks, and you're skipping that time in the ground that it would normally be in sort of, growing some vegetative growth and becoming a big enough plant to then start developing a crop on. So it's maximizing the time as well, isn't it? Being very, very efficient. So,
yeah,
um,
you don't need to wait for a space to come available to sow your seed. You can sow your seed anytime, so
yes.
you're not restricted by that. I will always, if I'm putting in a few rows of things, I will look at plants that I can do a little bit of intercropping. So, for example, if I'm putting in a couple of rows of cabbages, well, they're going to eventually need a fair bit of space, but it'll be a while before they get there. So, in between, I'll throw in some bok choy, or I'll throw in some radishes, so I
Yeah.
can get a quick, cheeky little crop between there and harvest those before those other ones fill out the space. Similarly, if I'm growing tomatoes or capsicum and they're getting towards the end of their cropping,
Hmm.
I'll clean up the lower leaves and put in some things
Yes.
between those rows and get them started early. I know this year when I was growing garlic, I had some garlic that I thought, well, okay, they're going to be coming up in about 6 weeks' time. I cleaned up some of the lower foliage. I put in a few rows of carrots between them so that they could
Ah,
get started while the garlic was maturing. And by the time the garlic came out, the the little seedlings were up and they're about this high.
yeah.
So it's trying to look at ways you can overlap your crops so that um, you're maximizing the production and just really making those beds work. I treat the beds as prime real estate, and I always make sure that there's stuff in there growing and growing hard and always pumping out stuff. At the moment, I've got out there's a couple of rows of beans, some beans that were coming towards the end, and I wanted to save some seed. I also had some beetroot that were hammered by the rain, but they're still producing.
Awesome.
Between those rows, I put in rows of corn to get them up and started. And by the time they start to shade those out, I'll pull those ones up. So always look for opportunities to interplant. I don't
Mhm.
follow any other kind of companion planting. I know there are books out there about companion planting and plants that work well. Like, this one is meant to stop some pest on here, and this one is meant to make this one grow better. I played around with that when I started gardening, and I really couldn't see any difference. And I just plant whatever I feel like out there, and I don't see any problems with the plants. I don't see any bad companions or good companions as far as
Mm.
improving things for each other. And I know a lot of new gardeners pick up on companion planting, and it can do their head in. I've had people come along to my workshops and say, "Do you practice companion planting?" No. Do you practice crop rotation? I say, well, I just replace a crop with something that's unrelated. It's as simple as that. And they go, "Oh,
Thank
I
you.
can let that go." I met one lady who had a spreadsheet where she was trying to crop
Oh my goodness.
cross this. How do I get the companion planting and the crop rotation issues? Because people see that, especially if they're new, that's what experienced gardeners must do. That's why they're good gardeners, and
Yeah. Well, I'm
it's not
glad that you
true.
can. I'm glad that you can share that. I mean, it's half the reason why I'm like, I'm trying to pick up on these things for people and actually how much it does matter. I think, going back to the soil, if you have
Mm,
healthy soil full of nutrients, by all means, if there's enough space in there for the root systems, there should not be any problems with any kind of companion or planting next to each other. The only thing that I've ever run into a problem with was corn and tomatoes in the same bed, and they were just very heavy feeders. So I
mm,
just needed to go a little bit harder on the feed. And when I'm in the garden every day looking at these
mm.
things, you tend to notice that and go, oh, I'm noticing a little bit of coloring going out of the leaves. Maybe it needs a bit of a feed this week. Um, obviously you mentioned compost. You've got your own compost system
Mm.
going. Does your compost completely supply your entire place year round, or are you bringing things in, or are you doing any liquid feeding? Talk to me about a little bit about the nutrition that you're adding into the soil.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think your compost nutritionally is only as good as the stuff that goes in it. So my compost is all made from stuff from my garden. I make enough compost to do all my beds using these no dig techniques where I'm just using the compost as a mulch.
Hmm.
I might put about a 5 centimeter layer on the surface of the soil once or twice a year.
Hmm.
And if I need to make more compost, I do some pruning. If I need some carbon for my compost, I'll do some pruning and I'll run it through my little chipper. So yeah, all the compost I need comes in there. I don't need to buy
Awesome.
anything in to make my compost. I wish I had access to manure that was easy to get hold of. So cow manure, horse manure, chicken manure. If I had chooks, it'd be fantastic. But I just don't have the time to look after chooks, so I don't keep
Yeah.
chooks. So I do buy, say, pelletized chicken manure.
Hmm.
I do use rock minerals, and I do have some liquid fertilizers. And if I'm preparing a bed to plant something that is a demanding crop, so it's a brassica that needs to be fed, as you say, with corn, I will add a little bit of extra nutrient to the soil, and then I'll just keep an eye on it. And if I can see that something needs a push, and if I've got time, I'll go out and throw some fertilizer on it.
Hmm.
But I've found the more I garden in this particular patch out the back, I've been gardening out there now for, I don't know, in this garden for 15 years or more. Uh, there is a fair bit of nutrition in that soil, and
Cool.
it's not dependent so much on fertilizers.
Hmm.
When I started, it needed a little build up of nutrition. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and I think that for new gardeners, you want to build up the nutrition of your soil. Use those organic fertilizers. They
Hmm.
will help you. If you're growing leafy greens, sometimes it feels good to mix up a bit of seaweed extract and
Hmm.
fish emulsion, and on a winter's day and it's sunny, go out there and give them a little taste. It doesn't have to be uh, full strength. Half strength is normally enough, just to give
Yeah.
them a little bit and just get them really kicking along. You'll end up with lovely, sweet, leafy greens. So
Mm.
yeah, do it. I think a lot of Australian soils are low in nutrition.
Hmm.
If you're not adding it, you're going to struggle a little bit. So get hold of good organic fertilizer. Get hold of a local manure to add to your compost, and your garden will love you for
Yeah,
it.
that's very true, Phil. Thank you for reconfirming that what goes into your compost really matters because um, I've put out a few bits of content trying to bring awareness to the composts that we get sold through hardware stores
Mm,
and how our green waste system essentially in this country is composted and sold back to us very
Mm.
cheaply and very poorly. But I mean, it's makes it accessible for more people, so I don't want to completely shame it completely, but a lot of these things, the quality just isn't there. And I'm running a side by side experiment,
Mm.
comparing fertilizers essentially. So I've got three really basic potting soils that I bought from the hardware store, and I'm using one with no fertilizer, one with a basic NPK, really standard chemical fake fertilizer, and then third, my diverse one that the organic blend that I put together. So um, I'm just trying to show that after we've produced a crop, I've cloned three identical chili clones from the same mother plant that was I picked out from seed. So I got the best genetic and cloned it three times, trying to make everything as similar as possible. And I want to test at the end the nutritional quality between the three different soils and the fertilizers, and over time see how that soil health is being built up with using organic techniques versus any chemicals, and then whether or not those chemicals end up in the chili at the end of the harvest, so something that I'm trying to demonstrate to people is the quality that goes in really matters in the quality that comes out. So I'm lucky enough with that I have chooks, so I get my chicken manure and use lots of barley straw for their bedding and things like this. So
Mm.
I get a lot of that in there and can create a compost system to work on my garden beds in a small suburban area. But one thing that you mentioned about, I guess, Lismore is tends to be slightly more fertile than maybe some of our cities might be.
Mm.
But you still have to build up the organic matter. You have to build the soil network and get it working for you.
Mm.
I've struggled for many years in areas where, for example, the last place I had, nice big garden, carved out some garden beds and things like this. But on the other side of the fence was a council easement where the council would go through regularly with Roundup and
Mm.
spray.
Mm.
And I'm battling trying to stop that coming into my
Mm.
garden. And,
Mm.
and it's virtually impossible these days. It's even been found in our rainwater. So
Mm.
it's a struggle that a lot of people have to face. And I think, like you said, spending that time to add organic matter to the soil, build life into the soil, it helps to mitigate that somewhat and give you some sort of buffer between those chemicals, at least. Have you got any thoughts on trying to avoid these contaminants and things like this, other than maybe just bringing awareness to it so that we can try to stop the use? But have you got any thoughts or things that you help people out with trying to avoid synthetics and weed killers and things like this?
Yeah, I think in a suburban situation, in a home garden, there's no need to be using them. And, we've got all these wonderful tools at our disposal for weeding and dealing with weeds. And I think there's a tolerance there with weeds that you can acquire. You know, um, I've got parts of my garden where I don't want weeds. So my vegetable garden, I work pretty hard on just keeping it as weed free as possible. So with routines, with a routine weeding, in the way I garden, I've got the compost on the surface, and I use a Dutch hoe, which I run through, or a wire hoe. For people who aren't aware of a Dutch hoe, it's an old timer's tool. It's basically
Yeah.
just a flat blade of metal, sharp on both sides, on a long handle, which you can push back and forth through the top layer of the soil, and it'll just cut off weed seedlings at
Hmm.
the roots. If you go through once a week in your garden beds and do that, you'll keep it weed free. As simple as that. It's such a simple thing to do. And that goes for your annual weeds, the things that just pop up from
Yes.
seed.
Hmm.
Different story if we're talking about oxalis, a
Oh,
perennial.
Yeah.
or or
Like a nut
onion
grass.
weed.
Oh,
Nutgrass is a different story as well. So
yeah.
that takes a little bit of effort to get rid of. And if you are wanting to garden in a spot where there's some nutgrass, if you want to grow food, you're going to be battling it all the time. And if you've got a real big nutgrass problem in your garden, I recommend to people that they build wicking beds so that they've
Yeah.
got a barrier
Yeah.
between the growing medium and the natural soil. And that goes for if you've got contaminated soil too. In a lot of old suburbs throughout Australia, there's lead and all sorts of other problems in the soil. Get your soil tested, find out what's going on with your soil. And you might decide that, well, okay, I don't want to mess with that soil. It's highly contaminated. There's all sorts of rubbish in there, all sorts of chemicals that have been sprayed there in the past. If I just build a bed that's above that, either a raised bed or a wicking bed where you've got a barrier and you've got a water reservoir on the base and you've got a 30 to 40 centimeter layer of growing medium at the top, you're going to be winning, and
Yeah.
you just fill that with clean soil. So I think, yeah, try to avoid it where possible. In your case, where you've got the council coming through and spraying liberally Roundup, you're probably getting drift into your garden as well. It'd be a problem with your plants.
It
You know,
was, yeah. I could
that
see
needs
it.
that needs a few letters to your local minister. I mean, that can't continue, that kind of behaviour, and it
No.
requires action from other people in your street to make a fuss about it.
Hmm.
You shouldn't have to put up with that. There's enough evidence out there that glyphosate can cause problems to your health, and
Hmm.
definitely to the health of your soil. And if you're a gardener, you don't want that stuff around. But
Absolutely. Yeah. You're right. You
you
gotta you gotta stand up and say something, really, don't you?
That's right. Otherwise, it'll continue. Be a pain.
Yeah. Well,
Annoy the hell out of them.
yeah. Well, that's right. And I think that's really cool to just like have techniques where you say just, create a barrier or try and make a fuss. Like it really matters. And I think I'm coming into like my wife and I are expecting a child mid next year, our first child, and I don't know whether you've got any kids of your own, Phil, but it's a exciting time for my life. Two kids,
Mm.
beautiful, and I'm really looking to bringing it back to the start of our conversation, get them inspired to be out in the garden and eating fresh produce and picking off the vine and sharing in that, and I guess sort of lastly, maybe you could touch on how you approached trying to inspire your children in the garden without pushing too hard so that they go, this is not cool anymore and go the other way. So what have you got on that for me?
Well, yes, I've got two boys, and they're very close together in age. And I was in my late 20s when I had my kids, and my head was just in the garden, straight into gardening. So, from a young age, I had them out there in the patch, hanging out with me, working amongst the plants, harvesting, connecting with the plants, planting, doing things together, and just enjoying that time together. It was more about the time together, but we're doing something that Dad loves and
Awesome.
he's passionate about. You know, just as they grew up, we're bringing so much of this food to the table. Fresh broccoli every night, cauliflowers, carrots, potatoes, and it was hard for me with my enthusiasm not to sit at the end of the table and give them a sermon about, look at this amazing food here, kids. It's from
Yeah.
our garden. But that's all they knew. And of course, they got sick of hearing me raving on about that. So I had to back off a little bit. Have they become gardeners? They're hitting 30 now, my kids. So you know, they have often said to me, like, now that I'm an adult, I realize how good it was to have such great food coming from the garden, and they appreciated that.
Awesome.
They both dabbled in gardening, but they haven't picked it up yet. But
Well,
the
that's all
seeds have
right.
been planted. one thing that has come out of that is they've got an appreciation for good eating and
Hmm.
eating fresh and eating organic.
Awesome.
They seek out good food, and they've had enough experience with their mates growing up to realize how bad food can be,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
how trashy it can be, and how processed it can be.
Yeah.
So they both focus on starting with good food. So that's the best thing I
Perfect.
think they've
Yeah.
got out of their
I
out
think
of
so
their
too. I don't even think
childhood.
that everybody has to garden because it's in an ideal world or ideal community, we share skills and share resources. So I am not very good at being handy around the house. So I would I would love somebody who's good at that, and I'll quite happily provide some produce for those services. So I think it's okay to have people that aren't inspired, but I love how you put that they still have this appreciation, and sometimes it does. Like I'm 32. I've just in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, I think, really started to appreciate my upbringing around my grandmother's garden and all of this, and really appreciate what it meant and why my view of good food is so what it is today. So
Mm.
yeah, I feel like you absolutely nailed that one anyway, and it's like it is such a fine line to not be so overly passionate and kill the joy for them, but it's
Well, I think you look. I'm terrible at washing up, and I'm lousy with a vacuum cleaner. But but I'm good at growing food. That's my contribution to the household. But I think I'd actually like to see everyone garden in the world.
cool.
I know the joy that it brings me, and the feeling that I get from being out in the garden. I
Yes.
chill. I get out there. I just get into the zone. I'm observing the bees, the butterflies, the insects. I'm loving the fact that they've come to visit.
Yes.
I'm looking at the soil and thinking how beautiful it looks.
Hmm.
It's very, very simple pleasures, but you know, I'm a happy person, and I think that gardening is a blueprint for a happy life, really. And you talked about the people in the blue zones, and there's an element of gardening there in all those blue zones across the world, where there's a gardening is an integral part of their lifestyle. I think gardening is a lifestyle choice. It's something that you put a certain amount of time into, and you practice. I treat it like a practice. I'm out there every day. If it's 10 minutes, I get 10 minutes out there, and it just feeds me.
Hmm.
Just being out there, and every time I'm out there, I'm learning something, and I look out into the garden, and it gives me great pleasure. So I feel like, is it just me, or is it something that everyone can pick up on? And you put the effort into the garden, you get so much back. So really, that's my thing. Is it's a good life in the garden, and if you've got an opportunity to get a few pots, grow a few things, uh, do it. You won't be sorry.
And thank you once again to Phil. Honestly, Phil is a really great inspiration to those looking to get started at home gardening, whether it's a small block, suburban block like Phil's. He's showing that you can really produce a lot of food. He was saying a lot of his grocery bill is produced at home. And I think that's something that we can all aspire to. And I love how at the end there, he said, just jump in and get started. Like, I highly encourage you to just do it, So if this doesn't inspire you, I'm not sure what will. But look, I'm very grateful to Phil for his time. Finally, a couple of things from me. If you're not following along, our Chili Side by Side series is still going on YouTube. It's looking wonderfully well. We've got our 3 clones in their final containers, and we're starting to see some results. So Go and check that out if you haven't already. Remember, my free organic growers guide is also available on the website. So check out the website. It's free to download, and you can get started with a few techniques of growing organic. Otherwise, please share this conversation around to more gardeners or more people that we hope to inspire and empower to get into the garden. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate your support. And once again, we'll see you again on the next episode.